there's a difference when you breathe it in. So don't let the corporate media take you for a spin. This the morning show, they put you in the know. So I hope that you ready, cause all we do is go, go, go. Yeah, come get your info, you be like, whoa. Here with the dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Speeding.
Hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to Wednesday. And today we have a complex, difficult topic that we are sure to botch up. So happy to have you joining us because you are part of this conversation. We are live and we do see your comments, questions, complaints, all the things that you write to us, particularly on our Facebook page and on our Twitter and Periscope. So go ahead and join that conversation. Let us know we're wrong today because, as I said, this is going to be a very complex, difficult conversation to kind of pull apart some of the detail. But before we get into it this morning, good morning, Andy. Welcome.
Good morning. And I just wanted to mention that I think that I'm the perfect co-host for that because of how many times I'm wrong.
You're never wrong, Andy. Ever. Doesn't happen. Not on this show.
I'm sorry, but you're wrong.
Very good. Good timing.
See what I did there? Yeah.
Very smart. So this morning we're going to talk about the dynamics of ethnicity or race in voting, particularly in what should be a thriving democracy. We don't necessarily have that in the US anymore. But in particular, I've been looking into race and the concept of race and just a little bit of background from where I'm coming from on this. I did not grow up in the United States. I am American, but my father worked for State Department. So my exposure during my formative years was not based on race per se. Like I would study the culture and language of my host country. I grew up with friends from all over the world. So when it came to being an American and running into other Americans, it was never a question of color or gender or identity. It was, oh, you're American. Cool, let's hang out. And I went through my high school years oblivious, literally oblivious to the dynamics of what was happening in America. And when I came back to the United States for college, it was shocking to me. Especially because I started my college career in Florida and oh boy, talking about race relations and things like that. So one of the things that has always been curious to me is this idea of race, that there are multiple races. And that's not true. I've tried to wrap my head around it. There is the human race, and then how we divide it into cultures and geography and heritage and things like that. Those, that's not race. And the more I started to peel things back and understand it a little bit, using the term race when we're talking about somebody who's from, like my family, Ireland and Poland, and someone who's from Jamaica or Haiti or Ghana, that is an othering that we do with language. And language is nothing more than the expression of ideas and images to convey meaning. So by elevating the differences of race, we are literally saying they are not like us, not people like us. So I've always been curious about why that gets forwarded. If you have ideas on that, let me know. Andy, how many races are there?
There's the 100-yard dash, the 200, the 400, the 800, the 1500, the 1 mile, and the marathon.
Right.
And the hurdles. Sorry.
Okay, so that was kind of spoken like an engineer. Well, technically accurate, in no way helpful, but thank you.
Thank you. I get that a lot.
Excellent. So part of where I wanted to explore this idea a little bit was in Latinos, because the first The first that I saw of, in particular, white people trying to dominate the conversation of race and culture during the last election cycle was white people had adopted the Latin X, the X instead of a Latino and a Latina. And I thought that that was curious because to me, as somebody who studied Spanish and cultures from Europe and South America, I'm like, that's kind of insulting. And the more I talked to people who were from those cultures, they were like, yeah, that is insulting. And then Mike, one of our longtime viewers, actually pointed out that the Latin X was it may have originated from feminists who were pushing back on languages that have gender. And I thought that that was curious too, because it's not for you to usurp a language and dominate it with your own ideas. Either you acknowledge what they have or you don't. So for white people out there in particular, most of this conversation is geared towards you to go through the education process, because oh boy, do we need it. Never use the Latin X, ever. Ever. The plural is Latino when you're talking about a group of people. If you're talking about a group of women, then use Latina. So there's that. But before we get into this conversation, because I think everything comes down to money and resources, there were a couple videos that I wanted to play this morning to kind of set the groundwork for the way that I'm looking at culture and language and voting blocks in particular in this country. So my thought is this is true for everyone, whether you're black, white, whatever. These rules apply to all of us, and I think that they play a big part in why we try to segment ourselves into smaller tribes and why white people are constantly getting it wrong. So Andy, you will enjoy this. This is, I'm calling this hipponomics. This is a father, I'm not sure where it comes from, so whoever did this, thank you. Someone in the South based on the accent, but this is a father trying to explain economics and systemic racism in our economic culture. And he used the Hungry Hippos game. I mean, I grew up with this. Most people know it.
Oh, okay. All right. Because I wasn't sure if you were talking about like hips don't lie, Shakira, or I want a hippopotamus for Christmas. So
yeah,
good.
no, this is
Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, Hungry Hippos. So I'm gonna play this video here real quick. It's really cute.
All right. You boys ready to learn about American socioeconomics?
Yeah!
All right, I got a piece of trim that's tilting our board up, and this hippo's starting with marbles of his own already. Here we go, let's play. The orange hippo is the lower class. He was born without the same resources as the other hippos. He's going to have to work a lot harder than them, and if he doesn't like it, well, then he's a piece of shit. Green hippo is the upper class. He started the game with marbles already, giving him an advantage, and the board is tilted in his favor, helping him to get more marbles than he'll ever eat. The piece of trim represents legislation like Citizens United, data patent laws, and super low tax rate that tilts the market in the favor of the upper class. The last two hippos represent the middle class. They have the numbers to level up the board and make it fair again, but there's just one problem. The green hippo owns all mainstream media and keeps the middle class hippos divided. Pro-choice, pro-choice! Huh, pro-choice, you can't even choose the right bathroom to piss in. Ah, music to my ears.
Okay, so that was a video, super cute, and it was a very basic level of, I think, an accurate depiction of where we are, right? We have groups of people of various ethnic heritage who have been sidelined based on rules and policy, and then you have this group we call the oligarchs, who are controlling congressmen. They're outright buying congressmen and women, and driving policy that benefits them. And then they pit the middle group, which is just about everybody, 90-some% of us, against each other, and encourage this idea that we other each other, that you are not like me, I am part of my tribe of white middle income, suburban, whatever, right? So you're not like me, therefore you are either not as good, you're dangerous, all of these things.
I've already named the green hippo Karen.
There you go. Okay, so Karen, the green hippo. So I thought it was just a delightful way to explain it and to kind of lay the foundation for systemic racism in policy. And we have seen, like the interview with Frank Ryder, we've seen that this has gone on for hundreds of years, and layer upon layer of policy has been built upon this. And this is what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter thing. It should be a no-brainer that we all get due process, but we still have to go back and explain this to people who are either ignorant or willfully refusing to acknowledge that we are people, we are all citizens, and we all deserve the same rights, right? So show them the hippo video. Maybe that'll help them. And then there was this other, it was a TED Talk that I came across, a gentleman named Phil who was doing a sociology study out of UC Berkeley. Berkeley, bastion of liberalism, isn't it? Right? So what could he possibly study there to get divergent views? Well, what he actually looked at was the idea of a non-level playing field and how it changes behaviors. And I thought it was really interesting because he took a group of students and used Monopoly. So here's another game, Monopoly, which is well known to start fights in families. But what they did with this game, and I'll let him explain it in detail, is he actually took the game and rigged it for one of the players, the same way the green hippo in the last example had it rigged for him. So, or for Karen. So I want to play this one. And this one's a little bit long. I did edit it down, and I will post a link to the full TED Talk. The full TED Talk's like 16 minutes, but I only captured like 2.5 minutes of it because I think it's very telling about how our behaviors change based on our success or lack thereof. We've seen these studies before, but I think he does it in a fun kind of exploratory way. So I'm going to play that one now.
I want you to, for a moment, think about playing a game of Monopoly. Except in this game, that combination of skill, talent, and luck that help earn you success in games as in life has been rendered irrelevant because this game's been rigged, and you've got the upper hand. You've got more money, more opportunities to move around the board, and more access to resources. And as you think about that experience, I want you to ask yourself, how might that experience of being a privileged player in a rigged game change the way that you think about yourself and regard that other player? So we ran a study on the UC Berkeley campus to look at exactly that question. We brought in more than 100 pairs of strangers into the lab, and with the flip of a coin, randomly assigned one of the two to be a rich player in a rigged game. They got 2 times as much money. When they passed go, they collected twice the salary, and they got to roll both dice instead of one, so they got to move around the board a lot more. And over the course of 15 minutes, we watched through hidden cameras what happened. And what I want to do today for the first time is show you a little bit of what we saw. You're going to have to pardon the sound quality in some cases because, again, these were hidden cameras. So we've provided subtitles.
How many 500s did you have?
Just one.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I have 3. I don't know why they gave me so much.
Okay, so it was quickly apparent to players that something was up. One person clearly has a lot more money than the other person, and yet, as the game unfolded, we saw very notable differences and dramatic differences begin to emerge between the two players. The rich player started to move around the board louder, literally smacking the board with their piece as he went around. We were more likely to see signs of dominance and nonverbal signs of displays of power. and celebration among the rich players. All right, we had a bowl of pretzels positioned off to the side. It's on the bottom right corner there. That allowed us to watch participants' consumatory behavior. So we're just tracking how many pretzels participants eat. And as the game went on, one of the really interesting and dramatic patterns that we observed begin to emerge was that the rich players actually started to become ruder toward the other person. Less and less sensitive to the plight of those poor players, and more demonstrative of their material success. More likely to showcase how well they're doing. Okay, and here's what I think was really interesting, is that at the end of the 15 minutes, we asked the players to talk about their experience during the game. And when the rich players talked about why they'd inevitably won in this rigged game of Monopoly, they talked about what they'd done to buy those different properties and earn their success in the game. And they became far less attuned to all those different features of the situation, including that flip of a coin that had randomly gotten them into that privileged position.
So thank you for sticking with us on that one. But here again, you could see that in this example, the green hippo people who are playing the Monopoly game, through the course of the game, seem to forget that they started with an advantage that the other players didn't have. And in their example, I'll again post the link, you had students of different ethnic backgrounds. And of course, this is UC Berkeley. You know, it's supposed to be this liberal bastion, right? So how are these great liberal students actually doing something that is contrary to the liberal ideals of cooperation and all of this? Well, it's a construct of our economy and the way that we nurture this idea that you're bootstrapping yourself. You did it on your own. You're your own island. Nobody helped you. No society. The roads that we put together, the bridges, all of these things had no effect whatsoever on your commute to work and the performance that you put in. It's a myth. And so I want to use that as a framework to start pulling back on particularly the white view of voting blocks. Like, I think we're doing a better job of understanding that conservatives are not a monolithic bloc, and how do we need to speak to them. We're doing a better job that the black vote, and we saw this during the primary, particularly when you had a Democratic state representative from Georgia who's black come out and speak at the RNC convention in favor of Trump. And then we saw older black voters decidedly go for Biden instead of Sanders. So we're getting a really good picture as white people that black is not a monolithic voting bloc, but we still don't see the Latino vote in that way, and we need to. So that is the premise that I'm starting with here. In addition to that, I believe that it is the white dominant culture that is propagating the othering, and we need to stop doing that. We need to start recognizing people as people. For example, we have more in common with our conservative neighbors of any ethnicity as working people than we will ever have with an oligarch who looks identical to us. And in fact, when you look at progressive policy, and I've lived this experience a number of times, when I talk to a Tea Party person about progressive policy and they get to hear it unfettered in an honest display, 9 out of 10 of those policies they will actually agree with. So this is the framework that I'm starting to pull this from. So what I'm relying on is those of us who are from a Latino heritage, whether it's European, South American, or whatever that makeup is, weigh in. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what I'm missing, because this is such a huge topic. We're not going to be able to cover it all in one episode. We'll explore this as we go through. So it's the whole idea that white people decide who is white. that I want to look at this morning. So one of these happened yesterday on Twitter. I'm going to put this up here. So Tariq Sheed on his Twitter feed was talking about Latinos, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on what he was talking about, but he used the term white Hispanic, which I thought was interesting. And then in that thread, you had a couple white supremacists pop up and say, well, now you're being racist, and went back and forth. So it's this idea of, and it never occurred to me, but when you fill out a form on something and you get your race, we call it race. This is white people making the form. We call it race. And are you white? Are you black? Are you white, Hispanic origin, non-Hispanic? Why do we separate those things out, right?
And it's usually at the top of the form.
Yep.
Right, one of the very first questions.
Right. So if race is the accurate term to use, then how can you possibly segment it further from race Latino or race white non-Latino? How is that even possible unless race is not the right term, right? So, and it's this whole idea of white and Hispanic. Where does that come from? Because most white people of non-Latino origin would never suggest that a Latino is white. And that is a hugely incendiary thing to say. But if we're going to be honest about it, most white people of European heritage would not categorize a Latino person as white, but Latinos do. So this is part of pulling back on this misnomer of a voting bloc. So now we have to recognize that there are white Latinos and non-white Latinos. Well, how can that be? Depends on your heritage. And we have this great interview coming up on Friday with Mike, one of our longtime viewers here, who is of Cuban heritage, who kind of explains some of that. And what was interesting to me, Andy, is after doing that interview, I completely put my foot in my mouth and mentioned, well, me as a white person and Andy as a white person, we don't get it. But here was somebody we had just been talking to, and we recorded it in advance, but we had just been talking to who identifies as white. And I, not thinking about it, just kind of ruined the whole interview by going back to the habits that I'd learned living in this country.
Well, but as bad as that may have made you felt when you said it, that's exactly what we're trying to wrestle with here, right? Like, I mean, we're trying to, and progressives typically, people on the left, and I'm trying to be the whole thing. It's a fight to try to be inclusive, but try to understand why that's important, right? And so if we're looking at what we do and what we say, we have an entire lifetime of messages that either, consciously or subconsciously, we have to try to fight through, because those messages were sent to us in order to divide the people, like race, like color, right? And so there are a lot of those different ones, and we talk about, we're trying to wrestle with, who's white and who's not white, as if that even mattered. But we also hear stories about, Black people who have racist views about people that are dark-skinned as opposed to light-skinned, right? Which just shows you how ridiculous it is to use racism to divide people.
Well, especially dividing ourselves, and that is where we are so preoccupied. But I am still going to argue that it is the white culture that is dominating that conversation and deciding who can and cannot be white, while also encouraging that infighting. And I'll go through a couple of examples where I it's hard to see it any other way, but real quick, I want to get to good morning, Mike. Good morning, Lee. Lee posted a comment here I want to read. He said most Americans are a few months missed pay away from homelessness, but they aren't a few months double pay away from being millionaires. And I think that's kind of the point, right? I have more in common with my neighbors, even my neighbors who are at a lower economic standard than I am, than I ever will with a Paris Hilton or somebody like that. It's just, that's the reality of the situation. And I know that we kind of joke about that, well, we don't want to tax millionaires because someday I might be a millionaire. Well, okay, so the monopoly game is kind of an example of where that comes from. Someday I might be a millionaire and screw everybody else. So
right. And I mean, it's all of these it's all about labels, right? It's all about having to put people in little files, in little folders, and how they're labeled. And I give examples of that. Even as a musician, the very first original act that I ever played in was back in the early 90s. And it was a real mixed bag of different sounds. And it was more to do with the musicians that came together into this band had a very wide variety of different musical styles. And so we recorded an album, but it was an entire across the board of different genres of music. Like there were some very country-esque sounding songs on this, but there were some actually pretty good rocking songs in this too. There was a really cool blues number on the B-side. And so, but the industry struggled to label us, right? They didn't know what to call us. But why was that important? Why did we have to be labeled, right? Like that they didn't know what genre we fit into. I said, well, maybe we fit into all the genres because that's just the way we ended up recording our music, right? But they ended up, I think, calling us adult contemporary or something that nature is like, well, I don't want to just be labeled that and just be able to be played on like elevator music radio stations, like, so I think that it's human nature to want to place labels on people and things just because that's in our nature, right? It's when we weaponize that is when it's the problem, right? And that's what we're seeing now and through centuries, through the world through race and religion and gender, all that stuff, that everybody requires a label. And when you turn around and use that against people, that's the problem. That's where the problem starts, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh, so this is interesting. This I didn't know. Lee put in another comment here, and he was referencing the monopoly example. He says, land and property are finite constructs. He says, I've asked people how much new land is being made every year. Well, obviously none. And he says, some of the founding fathers advocated for much harsher estate taxes. They wanted no land to pass down to the next generation, which is an interesting concept, right? Because then you take those marbles away from the Karen Green hippo and everybody starts over with every generation. So from a religious context, we have this too. In all the Abrahamic religions, you have the Jubilee year. Every 7 years, your debt is forgiven, indentured servants are released. All of these things are supposed to happen every 7 years. We don't have that in the United States. Weird, right? So
yeah, there's been some through my experiences in producing the podcast. There's a wonderful one that we did with Derek Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
And Derek is an advocate for a number of different progressive policies and a leading voice with other economic leaders in reparations. But one of the policies that he was advocating for was for a baby bond, right? And so when a baby is born, there is a bond set in their name, and when they reach a certain age, they are able to claim that, right? Which is kind of a way to make sure that nobody gets left behind,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is a wonderful policy if you're talking about getting rid of generational wealth, right, through taxes, because then at least everybody's starting at a position where they can be comfortable, but they're not living in a hierarchy where they're in the wealthy elite and that just multiplies generation after generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what we're seeing now in oligarch society.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that particularly my understanding of Latino culture is very big on family and taking care of family, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I can see why some of those policies might chafe in certain cultures and groups. So let's take a deeper look at. Well, in particular, my curiosity, and most people, would be how are Latino folks so into conservatism and in particular Trump? Because most Latino families, either, the cafeteria Catholics or whatever else, there's still a strong moral foundation, whether it's religious based or not. Like I would call back to the Cristeros War. It's something I've studied quite a bit, is particularly how Woodrow Wilson funded the non-religious, secular, almost Marxist regime that was rising in Mexico to wipe out Catholics, including priests, nuns, lock them in churches, set them on fire. And there is an actual quote from one of the aides to Woodrow Wilson was, so long as they're targeting Catholics, we're all for it, right? So how does this particular group identify themselves as conservatives? And one of the curiosities for me is Latinos for Trump. So we saw this group rise enthusiastically in 2016, and they haven't left. Despite the headlines and everything else we're seeing, they're still pretty strong. And I think that this particular article that I'm putting in here from Raul Reyes, I can't roll my R's, but he actually touches on it. He doesn't say it explicitly, but here in his article, he was talking about this book that an author wrote, and the author went on to explain, my main goal was to explain the phenomenon that seems very perplexing to the media. By media, I think he's saying white people and Americans in general. To many people, the idea that there is consistent, significant Hispanic support for Republicans is something of a mystery. Not quite, in my opinion, but we'll go on. He says he acknowledges that the GOP decades-long effort to cultivating Hispanics from 1972 to 1992, he posits that the Republican Party was more hospitable to Latinos than it was in subsequent years. And then he goes on to point out the loyalty created in the past has proved enduring because some Latinos have been voting Republican their entire lives. They will not necessarily abandon their party, even amid criticism of Trump for espousing xenophobia and racism. And what I want to point out here that this particular author and the reporter neglected to mention was, and it's pretty simple, Republicans went out of their way to create a bridge for the Hispanic community by treating them like people. by respecting them as humans and individuals and listening to them. And even though the motivation might have been, let's speak in particular to the swing state Latino communities, maybe there was some manipulation on that part. But the acts that they did by reaching out and talking to people like people and listening to their concerns and welcoming them in created a relationship that has endured for decades. So now you have moms and dads raising children. Those children grow up. It becomes part of heritage and culture. And we see that also on the left too. I'm a lifetime vote blue person or whatever, but this should not be a new concept. When you respect people and their family and what their concerns are, of course they're going to respond. And so for Democrats and neoliberals to be confounded by this idea, I think is very telling.
I would agree with that completely, and I think that the one thing that we always want to guard against is stereotyping different groups of people, right? Like, I mean, we have, you know, the orange in chief in the White House. One of the very first statements that he said when he was running for president was, you know, we're getting all these Mexicans, they're sending the rapists and the murderers, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's stereotyping Mexicans in that way.
Right? But that's not what they say. They see that comment and they say, well, he's not talking about me. He's talking about criminals.
But I agree with that. But what my point is that as a white person looking at that group, it's equally wrong for me to stereotype all of them as the same, voting in the same way.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
We realize and we understand that the neoliberal regimes that have been in power since Reagan have, you know, basically destroyed the middle class. That middle class is not just white people or black people or brown people. That's everybody, and that's a class war, right?
Right.
We have to think in those terms, right? So the Latino people that have lived in the United States for all those time have been equally have had to deal with that same issue where the wealth inequality and the classes have changed so drastically, right? So if you're a Latino in the United States, you know, is no different than anybody else. You've come to understand to a certain degree that the governments that you have in power are all equally bad. And at some point you would say, we have to break this cycle. And the only choice they're going to give you is Trump. Well, then that might not be a bridge too far. If that breaks the cycle of neoliberal centrist governments, then so be it, right? And that's all depends on the person if that isn't a bridge too far, right? And I think that we have to think of it in terms of people wanting their futures to be better and not thinking that, well, I'm not voting for that person. And the other point that I wanted to make was that in the interview that we did with Jerry Wendt, where he was talking about the differences between homophobia and racism, is that as a gay man, he could always become closeted again and hide the fact that he was gay, right? Mm-hmm. Black and brown people don't have that ability. They're out there.
Right.
Right? And we're talking about Latino people, if they appear, quote unquote, white to other European whites, per se. And I don't want to, try to, I'm trying not to do that thing. But is that a way of them hiding the fact that they're Latino because of, well, I'm just another white person, right? So you can't discriminate against me.
Yeah, I don't know. I would have to defer to people of that community because one of the interesting things from my own heritage is in Ireland, there was this period of huge immigration of Mexicans to Ireland. So now in Ireland, parts of Ireland, particularly on the West Coast, you have Irish people of Mexican descent. Are they still Irish? Depends on who you ask. And it always goes back to the gatekeeper who happens to be European whites, or seem to be the gatekeeper and arbiter of who is white, who isn't, who gets to be in this club. And I find that that's an interesting dynamic, particularly when you talk about neoliberals, Andy, because one of the curious things that I was looking at when we were, you know, pulling through all these articles about Latinos for Trump, in my mind, I kept going back to, well, what is the flip side of this? And in the Black Lives Matter protests, we can see, let's be honest, lip service from the left, the Nancy Pelosi's and things like this. So you get the performative support of changing a street name, or when she was kneeling in the kente cloth, I just wanted to scream.
Right. It doesn't cost their donors any money.
Right.
It doesn't take away from their profit margin. That's the difference between centrists, liberals, and progressives, is that the decisions are based on whose profit is going, if profit is of their donors is going to be removed. And then it's a non-starter.
Right. Well, in something like due process and equal protection, there should be no profit motive in it. And I'm still trying to understand where a Nancy Pelosi could not, who's facing a primary challenger right now, you would think politically, strategically, she would want to come out as a champion like Cori Bush. That's how she won her primary, right? So why wouldn't a Nancy Pelosi or a Chuck Schumer do something more than performative? Even if they knew that Mitch McConnell was never going to bring it to the Senate floor, wouldn't you, at least strategically, politically, write up something that actually has meaning and value rather than just going through, well, we're going to change a street name, or you will allow you to paint on the street Black Lives Matter. That does nothing. And I think we see that same thing from, there go my dogs.
He's just agreeing with you.
Right. Well, no, yeah. What happened was we cut down a tree. It was a tree that was not doing well. And so the squirrels had to relocate, but they relocated to the tree in our backyard. So cause and effect.
They're out protesting your tree cutting.
Yeah, well, I've actually had
around with protest signs in a circle outside around the backyard tree.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, I've had the squirrels actually come up to me and yell at me and then run away. So that's what's happening. But so I want to get into what this actually looks like. All right, Andy, hold this. I'm going to go beat a dog. I'll be right back.
Okay, enjoy that. As Kerri goes and beats a dog, I think it's important that maybe we'll just wait here to see who wins, if Kerri or the dog wins.
The dogs are always going to win. The dogs are always going to win. And this is working from home. My colleagues are loud and rude. So, yeah. So anyway, but thank you for covering for that, Andy. So I wanted to get into an extreme view in my mind that kind of illustrates how European whites are the arbiters and gatekeepers of who is white. And this is an example from a couple years ago. But I want to, come on, click. All right, here it is. So, Southern California, Johnny, whose real name is Juan. Johnny was a member of several white supremacist groups, and he's Hispanic. This is his cultural heritage. He's Hispanic. But notice he didn't use his name Juan. He referred to himself as Johnny, an Anglo-White name. And in this particular example, Johnny, this was on Univision News, so if you want to go and look this up, and I think I posted a link to part of it, but it's an interesting thing because Johnny says that the Proud Boys aren't racist, and they're all about, you know, all of these groups aren't necessarily racist, even though the Southern Poverty Law Center has identified them. He says, no, they're not racist. Well, if that is true, Johnny, why were you not going by your given name, Juan? Right? So it's an interesting dynamic that on some level, Juan understood and recognized that he could not be Juan and be in this group that caters to an Anglo-White perspective. So he therefore denied, hid, or did not acknowledge that his heritage and background, the name his mother gave him, in order to participate in this group. And I think that that is an interesting concept, and you can go in so many different directions, right? So if you are Omarosa working in the Trump White House, how much of yourself are you denying to keep that job? If you are a person of color in whatever ethnic background, and you are an intern underpaid without health insurance and coverage, and you work in the Pelosi office, how much of yourself do you have to deny or excuse or hide in order to fit in that office? And then we look at that with these policymakers, like Wolf, the DHS head who is currently serving illegally, who has no problem denying his own ethnic background and Latino heritage to draft this policy to pull children away from their families at the border. Because in some sense, I am not that. I am better than that. I came here legally, or my great-grandparents came here legally before there were immigration laws. Therefore, I am other than this group. And I find that no other example other than the Latino white supremacists really kind of captures the human condition and mindset that we get into here. So,
is it possible that maybe we're talking about a factor of fear here? That if you're a Latino in the United States and you're aware of the discrimination and the fear and police brutality, and you're afraid for your own existence, if you are, quote unquote, look white and deny your Latino heritage, maybe that's a safety factor that allows you to, slide through society and just deny that's your background altogether. Is that not within the realm of possibility?
It could be. And there's a lot to ponder here. I mean, without speaking to this particular individual, but this is where I want to open it up to the audience who's watching this morning. What do you think? Where do we go with this? And all of this is presented not as empirical evidence, but for consideration, right? These are pieces that we really need to take a hard look at, and where do we end up at all of this? And Cynic, who's watching on Twitter and Periscope, says, You can't stereotype the president. He's one of a kind, senile, racist, egotistical, and the worst president. The world laughs at America. You voted in a communist sympathizer who loves Putin. Bring back McCarthy. Interesting topic that you talk about McCarthy, because this is one of the tactics that the alt-right is using right now, is they're calling all anybody who does not think like them, who happens to be a little bit to the left, they're calling them all Marxists, right? Which is an incorrect term and just further goes to muddying the waters of the conversation, and then, you know, American ignorance of political ideology. We just don't, you say Marxist and they think, oh, bad, but what does that really mean?
And that's that comment that you just read is very very much one that is used by the vote blue no matter who crowd, right? That's, you know, Russia, resist pink cats, and
yeah,
you know, I
right. Well, before we,
right?
yeah, nothing good. Before we get out of here, there's one important data set that we really need to take a look at here. Because I don't want to leave it, you know, white supremacist Latino. This is the important point. And this is data that I gathered from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and then the Department of Justice. They have these really good reports, and I posted a link to these. So it's hard to come by updated information from the Department of Justice, go figure. So they had this report that goes 2011 to 2013 and then to 2015. So I pulled out some of the statistics here, because when we talk about Black Lives Matter, some of the pushback that came from particularly Latino communities, what about brown bodies? But then you still have this dichotomy of white Latinos as opposed to, I don't know, if they're not white Latinos, what are they? But the overarching point is that Anglo-Whites still get to decide who is white, who is worthy, who gets to be part of this club. And I think the statistics here bear out what exactly is happening. So you can see hate crimes rising exponentially. So in the charts, if you go out to the DOJ, it was down to about 12% in 2013, and then rose sharply to what we're seeing now just a few years ago, where it's upwards of 20%, which, you know, feels like 20%, that's a little number. Little means it doesn't matter. But we're talking about people, families. And hate crimes are act of terrorism, because not only are they for the moment, they're for everyone who's witnessing it, and they stay with the victim, and it changes behaviors. It changes all of the ways that they interact with society, with neighbors, with people who look like the people who victimize them. It has an effect that's exponential in society. So when we go back to talking about treating people as people, we have to recognize the cause and effect of hate crimes. And these numbers cannot be understated, right? So particularly when we look at police, and I swear, Friday, I'm going to give the dogs each a jar of peanut butter and lock them in a crate, because this is just I can't even hear myself think. So I apologize.
You're doing fine. Just keep going. You're doing fine. Yeah. It's all good.
I apologize for but this is the overarching point, right? We have an entire group of people that is being looked at as one solid group, and they're not. They're not. Just like me as someone from Irish and Polish heritage, those two groups and my ethnic identity, I understood based on tradition and nurture about what genocide does, about what war does, about what it means to truly resist a fascist regime. Those things were passed down to me. Whereas someone else who is a white person of a non-Polish or non-Irish descent, or whose family came to this country under different circumstances, might see the events of today wholly different than I do. So in that context, I hope that we're educating white peoples to look at neighbors differently, and to just sit down and have a conversation, talk to each other, treat each other like people, and try to understand where they're coming from, regardless of if they're a Trump voter or whatever else. You're probably not going to convince them to not support Trump, but you can have a conversation about economics and family and hopes and dreams, and explain your position without using the name Trump, without using the name Biden, or whoever it is you're supporting. I think this is part of what we're missing here. And I think we're being victimized by corporate media who profits from this division.
Of course. And a story that I like to tell, because it's very Canadian, and it's not that the details aren't that well known outside of Canada. But in the 80s and 90s, when there was a large separatist movement in Quebec to separate from Canada, we went through that whole thing. For the most part, that was portrayed by the media and by the governments as being the reason that the Quebec people wanted to separate is because they were afraid of losing their French heritage and the French language, very cultural things, right? But when it got down to it, when they talked to the people in Quebec and asked them why they were voting to separate from Canada, for the most part, they said, my child can't find a job, or can't afford a home, or whatever. And it was for real concrete reasons that, well, what we have now isn't working out for our group or our family. We want to take the chance to see if that gets better if we separate. And it had nothing to do with the heritage, the way the media was portraying it, right? So thinking that you understand why people do what they do without actually finding out the reason is just as wrong as stereotyping an entire group of people that are going to vote the exact same way, or that an entire group of people are all, drug addicts or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. It's every person is an individual. And that's the whole idea of democracy, is one vote for one person, right?
Right.
We can't say this group is all going to vote the same way, or this group should all vote the same. That's not democracy. We have to remember that.
Yeah. I think that's where we're going to leave it today, because we're actually at the top of the hour. But I hope this illustrates that we have not even scratched the surface of this particular issue. And then I personally am looking forward to showcasing the interview that we did with Mike. And then we're trying to get another interview with a lovely individual who's Puerto Rican and immigrated to Florida after hurricane after hurricane, and the way that we treated our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico. So I want to give those two perspectives to further illustrate that Latino is not a monolithic group. So I need to go deal with the squirrel invasion. But Andy,
are you about to commit murder?
They both have beautiful fur coats. I'm thinking that they might look good in a coat. So
I remember when we were having problems with squirrels in our home, and looking up in Canada the different hunting seasons, right? And deciding to see when it was okay to shoot a squirrel. And so I went online, and of course there's hunting seasons for moose in this country, and deer and wild turkey and bear and partridge. And so of all of those things, the only thing that the hunting authority in Canada said that you could hunt all year round was a squirrel. Basically just because they're assholes.
They really are. They're cute, but oh, okay. They're literally sitting outside the patio door, taunting the dogs. Is what's going on. So they just know. That's exactly right. Okay, so thank you for bearing with us this morning, especially my dogs. And we'll be back Friday, and as we mentioned here, we're definitely going to show you the interview that we did with Mike. I hope to have some more, and I'll look forward to your comments. So before we get to Friday, if you have a story or some segment of this that we haven't touched on that you really think that we need to talk about, let us know on Digital Liberation Front Live on Facebook, or you can send us a tweet at progressive ins, INS 5. So I think that's it for us, and we'll see you back here on Friday. Have a good day.
Take care.
We bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keeping it G. Whoa.